So here's the thing. We find ourselves in a dilemma, and you have some interesting perspectives on this. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about the climate crisis. And we find that even in our program, in our broadcast, we are, first of all, not as diverse a group as we would like to be. And secondly, possibly following on from that first point, we are not addressing the social injustice involved in climate change. And you had some interesting thoughts on that. You had in our phone call just now. Could you go back to that and talk about those 2 or 3 points?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to, Carl. And thank you very much for reaching out to me and sparking this conversation. I think it's outstanding that there was a recognition of what might have been missing in terms of not only visible presenters, but also concepts and topics that are important and central to a discussion on climate change.
There's almost an organic process that makes that happen. And you talked about that on the phone just now, this way that we just kind of grow into this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you're putting together a group from the start that's going to tackle a task, tackle a project, it's very important to be intentional about what voices and perspectives are part of that group, because the end result is going to reflect the diversity, or on the flip side, the homogeneity of those perspectives, right? Because we sort of we exist in our circles. Our circles tend to reflect our preferences, our identities, and so on and so forth. And so if we don't have those really broad identities, perspectives at the table from the start, then it's really hard to be intentional about then creating an end result that reflects the broadness that we'd like it to have, right? So that's the sort of first thing here, the intentionality.
So what does an institution like ours, a team, maybe even a government organization or an NGO, what do we do in trying to make sure that we are being inclusive and that we are looking at things from the point of view of groups that are, well, traditionally not represented?
Well, it's all about, again, being intentional. So you have to have at least one person who is raising the issue during the formation of these groups, right? And saying, hey, look around. Does this represent the environment, the world, the whatever that we want, right? And if not, let's take active steps right now to create that community, create that diversity of perspectives, of representation that we want, right? So it just has to be something that you're thinking about from the get-go. And then you invite those individuals to participate, right? You just invite people to participate. So I would say, how do you get there? You have to be really overt about it. You have to be intentional. You look around the room and you say, hey, does everyone look like me? If so, that is a problem, because we might be missing things here. We might then end up, we've got blind spots that we may not even realize are blind spots. This is a process that Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, a leadership professor at Harvard Business School, wrote about as early as 1975 in a seminal book. She called it homosocial reproduction. It's not nefarious. It's not malicious. It's not intended to exclude certain individuals. But what it is when we expand, when we invite people to participate, when we look for people to join our organizations or whatever else, we tend to, if we're going to use sort of a referral type of approach, we tend to reach back to our own networks. And our networks, by and large, our social networks, professional networks, and whatever else, by and large, reflect us. They reflect our identities. They reflect our preferences. They reflect our circles. They reflect our educational institutions. etc. Right? They reflect our community organizations, they reflect our neighborhoods. And so if we solely rely on who do I know, well, I mostly know people who are like me.
It occurs to me that we can use this sort of microcosm of URI and this program and this, and that we can make it into a larger issue in terms of the approach toward the climate crisis, where that kind of intentionality in a group of scientists or in a group of thinkers, whether it's in the humanities or in the STEM fields or even in the arts. How could you see that playing out?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it's you bring together, and I like your point about really bringing together people from different avenues, or different academic disciplines, different interest areas. You got to be intentional in that way too, right? You got to find people who are really passionate about what it is they do, but also passionate about collaborating with others across boundaries, learning, right? Learning new perspectives and allowing their attitudes and thinking and behaviors to be influenced by what they learn. There has to be a level of openness. There has to be a level of willingness to learn on the part of individuals. And so when you can tap into not only different or people with different identities and different perspectives and different lived experiences, but also find ways to engage them in a learning process whereby everyone is learning from one another, really creating an environment where inclusivity and diversity and learning is not only valued and respected, but is, and I'm going to push you here, is encouraged and expected. Okay? Because that's what's ultimately going to push us towards these inclusive communities.
That's a really good point. The willingness to learn is important. I hear that and I appreciate that, but the expectation of the willingness.
And perhaps that'll be my last point, this notion of expectation. So all too often, organizations, programs, institutions view inclusive environments as a nice to have or as aspirational. And this is, and certainly it is aspirational, but it's aspirational in that one day we will get there. When you're aspirational and hopeful, as opposed to expecting, right, then that sort of gives individuals, that gives organizing committees a pass to not be intentional about things. The Americans with Disabilities Act moved from aspirational and hopefulness to we have to find a way for people with mobility limitations to be able to get around the city. And so what that means is carve these curbs. And what that means is kneeling buses. Make it happen, right? There's a level of this has to happen, not, for many years, that was very much in the United States in the 70s and before. Yes, it's just a thing that ought to happen. And, hopefully it'll eventually come. And even with the passage of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act in the early 70s, there still wasn't teeth around that to make it happen until later when you had folks that said this has to happen. And so around diversity, equity, and inclusion, let's move from aspirations and hopes to it has to happen.
Make it happen. That's the thing. Make it happen.
That's it. That's it. Make it happen.
Make it happen. Don't wish for it. Make it happen. All right. Well, thank you, Sean. Man, I'm so happy we talked.
Yeah, this was great. And as always, we always have wonderful conversations. These are challenging conversations. These are difficult conversations, particularly when you're talking about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there are conversations that need to happen, and individuals like us who are willing to engage, that is what is going to move us towards progress, right? Willingness to engage in the conversations